The fork fell with a clatter that sounded, to Alara Hayes' frayed nerves, like a gunshot. She didn't flinch. Years of balancing hot plates and fragile egos had trained the flinch out of her. Instead, she moved toward the sound, a polite, practiced smile already forming on her lips. "No trouble at all, sir," she murmured, plucking the offending utensil from the polished floor of the gilded lily. The man barely grunted his thanks, already deep in a loud conversation about stock options. Ellie retreated, her smile dissolving the moment she turned her back. The Gilded Lily wasn't a restaurant. It was a stage. Every night, the wealthy elite of New Orleans performed their lives here, set to the smooth, mellow soundtrack of a live jazz trio. And Ellie, with her crisp black uniform and silent movements, was just part of the scenery, a ghost who refilled their wine and cleared away their scraps. But inside her head there was a different kind of music. Not the lazy saxophone bleeding from the corner stage, but a furious, complex concerto. It was the music of a past-due rent notice taped to her fridge, the frantic rhythm of a final warning from the bank, the heart-pounding fear of losing the one thing she had left of her father, his piano. Her hands, now expertly wiping down a stray wine ring, ached to be on its worn ivory keys. They were hands made for Rachmaninoff, not for carrying trays of oysters Rockefeller. A sudden hush fell over the entrance, a subtle shift in the room's energy that made even the most seasoned staff straighten their spines. Ellie glanced up. He stood framed in the arched doorway, a silhouette of immense power against the humid New Orleans night. Julian Vance. His name was a brand, a myth whispered in tech circles and on the pages of Forbes. A self-made billionaire who had clawed his way up from nothing to build a digital empire. He was tall, impeccably dressed, in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, and he carried himself with an unnerving stillness. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't have to be. The room bent to his gravity. The maitre d', a man who regularly seated senators without batting an eye, scurried forward, his usual slick composure dissolving into anxious deference. "Mr. Vance, what an honor. Your usual table is ready." Vance's gaze swept the room, cold and analytical, dismissing the fawning maitre d' as if he were a piece of furniture. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, passed over the opulent decor, the well-dressed patrons, and the jazz trio before they landed, with unnerving precision, on Ellie. For a moment, she was pinned by his stare. It wasn't appreciative or lecherous, the way some male patrons looked at her. It was something else. A sharp, piercing assessment, like a hawk spotting its prey from 1,000 feet up. She felt an involuntary shiver trace its way down her spine. "No," Vance said, his voice a low baritone that cut cleanly through the ambient chatter. "I'll take a table in her section." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in Ellie's direction. A murmur went through the staff. Julian Vance never deviated from his preferred secluded corner booth, and he never, ever acknowledged the waitstaff beyond a curt order. Ellie's manager shot her a look that was a mixture of panic and warning. "Don't mess this up." She took a deep, steadying breath and walked toward the table he'd chosen, her notepad feeling flimsy and ridiculous in her hand. He was already seated, his companion a younger, nervous-looking man in a less expensive suit, fidgeting beside him. "Good evening," Ellie said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Vance didn't look at the menu. He looked at her hands. "A Macallan 25. Neat," he said. Then his eyes flicked up to meet hers. "And for you, the waitress—" "What's your name?" "Ellie, sir." "Ellie," he repeated, tasting the name as if it were an unfamiliar flavor. "Tell me, Ellie, the pianist over there." He gestured with his chin toward the stage. "Is he any good?" The question was bizarre. It felt like a test. "He's very talented, sir." A local legend, Vance mused, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. It's a shame, isn't it? When a beautiful instrument just sits there most of the night, only to be played by a local legend. His gaze drifted from the magnificent grand piano on the stage, a gleaming black Steinway, and then landed back on her. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She felt a hot flush of anger creep up her neck. How could he possibly know? Was this some cruel coincidence? "I'll get your drink, sir," she said, her tone clipped. The rest of the service was a masterclass in tension. Every interaction was laced with his strange, pointed scrutiny. He would ask her opinion on the wine pairing, then cut her off mid-sentence. He would watch her clear the plates, his eyes following the movement of her fingers. It was a targeted, psychological harassment, so subtle that no one else would notice, but to Ellie, it felt like a surgical dissection. He was searching for a weakness, a crack in her professional facade. She refused to give him one. She was a ghost, and ghosts don't have feelings. She moved with quiet efficiency, her face a mask of polite neutrality. But beneath the surface, the concerto in her head was reaching a frantic, crashing crescendo. The bank notice, the ticking clock, the weight of her father's disappointment, a ghost of a different kind, always sitting on her shoulder. "Your hands have a gift, Ellie Bean." Her dad's voice echoed in her memory, warm and smelling of sawdust and rosin. "Don't you ever let anyone or anything silence them." But she had. Life had silenced them. Necessity had silenced them. And now, this man, this stranger, seemed intent on rubbing salt in that very wound. Finally, the ordeal was over. He signed the check, the tip generous, to the point of being insulting, as if to say, "Here is your price." Ellie cleared the last of their glasses, her body humming with a mixture of relief and residual anger. As he stood to leave, he paused beside his associate, who was chattering nervously about a market forecast. Vance wasn't listening. He was looking toward the stage again, where the pianist was taking a short break. Then, loud enough for Ellie and several nearby tables to hear, he spoke, his voice dripping with a cold, philosophical detachment. "You see, Michael," he said to his companion, though his eyes were fixed in Ellie's direction, "true talent never stays hidden behind an apron for long." He paused, letting the words sink in. A chill went through Ellie. This was no coincidence. It either escapes, Julian Vance concluded, his gaze finally meeting hers one last time, sharp as a shard of glass, or it rots. He turned and walked out, leaving a wake of stunned silence. Ellie stood frozen, the crystal glasses on her tray trembling. The man's words were not just an observation. They were a verdict, a judgment. And as she looked at her own reflection in the gleaming surface of the bar, a tired waitress in a cheap uniform, she felt the cold, terrifying possibility that he was right. Julian Vance's words haunted Ellie for the rest of the week. They weren't just an insult. They felt like an indictment, echoing in the quiet moments between taking orders and the lonely walk back to her cramped apartment in the Marigny. It either escapes or it rots. The phrase looped in her mind, each repetition twisting the knot of anxiety in her stomach a little tighter. He came back 3 more times. Each visit was a new, refined form of torture. One night, he would discuss the nuanced phrasing of a Miles Davis solo with his dinner guest, just loud enough for Ellie to hear, his vocabulary sharp and academic. The next, he would idly ask her if the restaurant ever hosted real musicians, his eyes flicking pointedly toward the Steinway. He never mentioned the piano to her directly again, but the instrument became a silent, third party in their bizarre, one-sided conflict. It sat on the stage under the warm glow of the lights, a gleaming black monument to everything she had lost. Each night she went home, the first thing she did was lay her hands on the cool, aged keys of her father's upright piano. It was a Baldwin, its mahogany finish scarred with a lifetime of use. A coffee ring stained the wood near the high C, a relic from a late-night composing session of her father's years ago. Playing it was like having a conversation with his ghost. Tonight, her fingers stumbled through a difficult passage of a Chopin nocturne. Her technique, once flawless, had grown stiff. Her muscles, accustomed to the weight of serving trays, had forgotten the delicate strength required for a perfect pianissimo. The frustration was a physical ache. Her memory drifted back to a sweltering Louisiana summer when she was 16. Her father, Robert Hayes, sat beside her on this very bench, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't just a musician, he was a jazz philosopher, a man who saw the world in chords and progressions. He was trying to teach her the soul of improvisation. "Don't just play the notes, Ellie Bean," he'd said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Tell the story. Music is the only truth that doesn't know how to lie." He had been working on something then, a piece he simply called his sonata. It was his opus, a swirling, ambitious fusion of classical structure and raw, improvisational jazz. It was meant to be his legacy. He'd scribble notes on cocktail napkins, on the back of utility bills, humming melodies under his breath while he fixed the leaky faucet. He promised it would be the piece that finally got them out of this tiny apartment, that would give him the recognition he deserved. Then the diagnosis came. Fast, aggressive, and unforgiving. The sonata and all his other dreams were left unfinished. A sharp rap on her apartment door jolted Ellie back to the present. She froze, her heart seizing. It was too late for a friendly visit. A burly man in a polo shirt with a clipboard stood on her landing. She didn't need to ask who he was. She opened the door a crack. "Can I help you? Alara Hayes?" he asked, not unkindly. He consulted his clipboard. "I'm from Sterling Asset Recovery. This is the final notice regarding the outstanding debt. We've been authorized to repossess the collateral asset." He gestured vaguely into her apartment. The piano. Ellie's blood ran cold. I just need a little more time. I'm getting the money." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. "You have 1 week, ma'am," he said, his voice firm but not unsympathetic. 7 days. After that, it's out of my hands." He handed her a folded piece of paper and left. She unfolded it, her hands trembling. Final notice. The words screamed up at her. The piano wasn't just wood and wire. It was the last tangible piece of her father. It was her entire history, her only connection to the person she was supposed to be. Losing it would be like losing him all over again. The next evening at the Gilded Lily, Ellie moved through her shift in a fog of panic. Every clink of a glass, every polite request, grated on her raw nerves. She needed a miracle. And then, like a recurring nightmare, Julian Vance walked in. Tonight, he seemed different. The calculated cruelty in his eyes was replaced by a kind of brooding intensity. He was quieter. His presence more imposing than ever. He ordered his usual scotch and barely spoke to his guest. Ellie's hands shook as she approached his table to pour more water. Her mind was a chaotic storm of numbers and deadlines. She was so distracted, she didn't notice the slight puddle of condensation on the floor from an iced drink at the next table. Her heel skidded. Time seemed to slow down as the heavy glass pitcher tilted in her hand, a graceful arc of ice water heading directly for Julian Vance's $1,000 suit jacket. She gasped, stumbling to regain her balance. But it was too late. The water splashed across his chest and lap, soaking the fine Italian wool. His guest gasped. The whole section of the restaurant fell silent. Ellie braced herself for the explosion, for the icy rage, for the public humiliation that would surely cost her the job she so desperately needed. But Julian Vance didn't move. He didn't even look down at his ruined suit. He slowly lifted his gaze and met hers. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools of emotion. For a long, terrifying moment, he just stared at her, the silence stretching to a breaking point. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, a stark contrast to the public spectacle she had expected. It was a voice meant only for her. "Your father," he said, the words precise and devastating, "would be so disappointed." The air left Ellie's lungs in a rush. The noise of the restaurant, the accusing stares, the dripping water, it all faded away. The world narrowed to this man and his impossible, soul-shattering statement. It wasn't a question. It was a pronouncement. How? How could this stranger, this cold, arrogant billionaire, possibly know the deepest, most personal fear she carried in her heart, the one she whispered to herself in the dead of night? Who was Julian Vance? And what in God's name did he want from her? For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Julian Vance's words hung in the air between them, more shocking than the splash of ice water. Ellie's mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic about her job in the piano, suddenly went sharp and clear with a new, terrifying focus. "What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice tight with disbelief and a rising tide of fury. Her manager Antoine was already rushing over, his face pale with apology. "Mr. Vance, I am so terribly sorry. Alara, go to the back. Right now." "No," Vance said, his voice calm but absolute. He held up a hand, stopping Antoine in his tracks. He didn't take his eyes off Ellie. The other diners, sensing a drama far more compelling than their creme brulee, were now watching openly. The jazz trio had faltered into a confused silence. The fear that had held Ellie captive for weeks was suddenly burned away by a white-hot rage. This man had systematically tormented her, and now he had crossed a line. He had invoked her father. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice louder now, trembling not with fear, but with indignation. "How do you know anything about my father?" A flicker of something surprise, respect, crossed Vance's face before his mask of cool indifference slipped back into place. He leaned back in his chair, the damp patch on his suit forgotten. "I know that he was a man who valued talent above all else," Vance said, his voice projecting just enough to draw the entire room into their confrontation. "And I know he wouldn't want to see his legacy spilled on the floor of a restaurant." The audacity of it stole her breath. He was turning her humiliation, her private grief, into a public spectacle. He was using her father as a weapon against her. "You have no right," she began, but he cut her off. "Rights are earned," he said smoothly. He gestured with an elegant, long-fingered hand toward the stage, toward the Steinway. "They aren't handed out with an apron." This was it, the endgame. The purpose behind all the veiled comments and psychological jabs became sickeningly clear. He had been pushing her, goading her, waiting for her to break. Sensing his moment, Julian Vance stood up. He was a commanding presence, and the entire restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. "You think you have the right to carry his name?" he challenged, his voice resonating with theatrical power. "Prove it." He pointed a finger at the piano. "I've heard you can play. So play. Play something for me." The room erupted in whispers. Antoine looked like he was about to faint. "I will not be your evening's entertainment," Ellie spat, her pride the only thing holding her together. "Oh, this isn't entertainment," Vance said, a humorless smile touching his lips. "This is a business proposition." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a gold pen. "You're in debt, aren't you, Ellie? I can see it in your eyes. The kind of desperation that keeps you up at night." He uncapped the pen. "Let's make a wager." A simple bet. He named a piece Herbie Hancock's Chameleon. Not just the famous bass line, but the full, sprawling, notoriously difficult keyboard improvisation. It was a brutal technical and creative test, a labyrinth of complex chords and shifting time signatures. It was a piece designed to break a pianist. "Play that," he commanded. "Play it with the fire and skill a piece like that deserves. If you can do it, if you can impress me, I will write you a check right now for $50,000. A collective gasp went through the room. $50,000. It was a life-altering sum. It was her father's piano. It was freedom. It was an escape. But it was also a trap. The way he said it, the arrogant tilt of his head, the predatory gleam in his eyes, he expected her to fail. He wanted her to fail. He wanted to strip away her last shred of dignity in front of this audience of New Orleans' finest, proving his point that she was nothing more than a waitress with delusions of grandeur. She looked from Vance's cold, challenging face to the gleaming Steinway on the stage. It seemed to call to her, a beacon in the storm. For months, she had been drowning, pulled under by grief and debt. She had been shrinking, hiding, letting the best part of herself atrophy. "Don't you ever let anyone silence you." Her father's voice, clearer than it had been in years. The choice was simple. She could shrink back into the shadows, be fired, and lose everything. Or she could walk into the fire he had set for her and play. She lifted her chin, her gaze locking with Julian Vance's. The chaos in her mind settled into a single, sharp point of defiance. All the fear, all the anger, all the grief, it coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. "You have a deal," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent room. She untied the strings of her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on an empty chair. Then, turning her back on Julian Vance and the stunned onlookers, she walked toward the stage. Every step felt heavy, momentous, as if she were walking toward an executioner's block or a throne. At that moment, she wasn't sure which it was. The walk to the stage was the longest 10 yards of Ellie's life. The hushed whispers of the diners followed her like a physical pressure, a weight on her back. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, dissecting her, the tired-looking waitress in her sensible black shoes and simple slacks, daring to approach the magnificent beast that was the Steinway. Behind her, she could feel Julian Vance's presence, a cold, gravitational pull of judgment. He had set the trap, and she had just walked into it. She slid onto the polished piano bench. The keys were cool and smooth beneath her trembling fingertips, gleaming under the warm stage lights like a row of perfectly white teeth in a predatory smile. She took a moment, closing her eyes, shutting out the murmuring crowd, shutting out the smug certainty on Vance's face. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, syncopated rhythm. Breathe, Ellie Bean. Just breathe. Her father's voice, a calming baritone in the chaos of her mind. She was supposed to play chameleon. That was the wager. A flashy, technical piece to satisfy a billionaire's cruel whim. A musical circus act. But as her hands hovered over the keyboard, another melody rose from the depths of her memory. It was a melody of heartache and hope, of rainy afternoons in their small apartment, of a legacy left in fragments on yellowed sheet music. Her father's sonata. Music is the only truth that doesn't know how to lie. In that moment, a defiant clarity seized her. She wasn't going to be Julian Vance's trained monkey. This wasn't about his wager. This was about her truth. She let her hands fall. The first notes that filled the silent room were not the funky, syncopated bass line of Chameleon. They were haunting, melancholic chords, the opening bars of her father's unfinished sonata. A wave of confusion rippled through the audience. At his table, Julian Vance's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. This was not part of the deal. Ellie ignored it all. She leaned into the music, her focus sharpening until the world consisted of only her and the 88 keys in front of her. The sonata poured out of her, a story she knew by heart. The opening movement was steeped in a deep, classical sorrow, the notes carrying the weight of loss, of dreams deferred, of a brilliant mind, silenced too soon. Then she shifted. Her left hand began to weave in a complex, improvisational jazz harmony, her fingers dancing across the lower register. She was taking her father's classical structure and infusing it with her own fire. She began to merge his work with the challenge Vance had thrown at her. The angular, aggressive chords of Herbie Hancock's style started to appear, not as a separate piece, but as a furious, passionate counterpoint to her father's melody. It was a conversation, a battle. It was the music of a life lived in two worlds, the refined, disciplined world of her classical training and the raw, unpredictable reality of her daily struggle. It was the sound of a daughter trying to reconcile her father's legacy with her own broken reality. Her hands flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion. The music swelled, filling every corner of the opulent restaurant. It was no longer just a performance. It was a confession, raw and unfiltered, poured out in a torrent of sound. The clinking of glasses had stopped. The whispers had died. The entire room was captured, held in a state of stunned reverence. This wasn't a waitress playing the piano. This was an artist bearing her soul. Across the room, Julian Vance sat motionless. The cold, calculating mask he wore had shattered. His posture, once rigid with arrogance, had slumped slightly. His hands were clenched into tight fists on the table. As Ellie reached the crescendo, a crashing, dissonant chord that seemed to tear the air apart before resolving into a single, heartbreakingly beautiful note, she saw him from the corner of her eye. His face was a canvas of shock, of disbelief, and something else she couldn't name. Something that looked achingly like pain. A single, silent tear escaped the corner of his eye and traced a path down his stone-like cheek. The final note of the sonata hung in the air, a shimmering, resonant whisper that seemed to hold a universe of unspoken words. For a long moment, there was absolute silence, a stillness so profound it was almost sacred. Then, one person started clapping, a slow, deliberate clap from the back. It was followed by another and another until the room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar, a thunderous, heartfelt ovation that washed over Ellie in a wave of warmth and validation. People were on their feet, their faces lit with an awe that brought tears to her own eyes. She stood up, her knees weak, and gave a small, shaky bow. Her gaze swept over the crowd, over the faces of strangers who now looked at her as if they knew her most intimate secrets. And finally, she looked at Julian Vance. He was already on his feet, moving toward the stage. The checkbook was still in his hand. He walked through the parting crowd, his face unreadable once more, the brief moment of vulnerability gone. He stopped at the foot of the stage, the applause slowly dying down around them. He tore the check from the book with a sharp, decisive rip and held it out to her. She walked to the edge of the stage to take it. As their fingers brushed, he leaned in close, his voice a low, gravelly whisper meant for her ears alone, a sound drowned out by the lingering buzz of the room. "That sonata," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "Robert used to play that for me." The world tilted on its axis. Ellie stared at Julian Vance, the $50,000 check, a flimsy, insignificant piece of paper in her hand. His words echoed in her ears, louder and more shocking than the applause that had just faded away. "Robert used to play that for me." "What?" she breathed, the question lost in the renewed murmur of the diners. Vance's face was a locked vault. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and strode out of the Gilded Lily without a backward glance, leaving a trail of chaos and unanswered questions. The rest of the night was a blur. Antoine, her manager, was in a state of shock, alternating between staring at her with newfound respect and sputtering about protocol. Her coworkers treated her like a visiting celebrity. Patrons stopped by her station to offer congratulations, their eyes wide with wonder. Ellie moved through it all like a sleepwalker, her mind replaying that one impossible sentence over and over. She quit her job the next morning. She walked into the bank, deposited the check, and paid off the debt that had been strangling her for 2 years. The relief she expected to feel was absent, replaced by a hollow, gnawing uncertainty. The money felt like a bribe for a secret she didn't understand. She had to know. Finding Julian Vance wasn't hard for a man who owned half the city's skyline. His corporate headquarters, Vance Innovations, was a sleek tower of glass and steel that scraped the New Orleans sky. Getting to him was another matter. She was stonewalled by a phalanx of polite but firm receptionists and assistants. Finally, after 3 days of relentless calls and a refusal to leave the lobby, a different kind of assistant appeared, a severe-looking woman with a tablet, whose expression made it clear she was not impressed. "Mr. Vance will see you," she said, her tone suggesting it was against her better judgment. He was waiting for her in an office that was less an office and more a kingdom. A panoramic window offered a god's eye view of the city below. The furniture was sparse, modern, and brutally expensive. Vance stood by the window, his back to her, looking down at the city he had conquered. "You're persistent," he said, without turning around. "You owe me an explanation," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the intimidating setting. He finally turned. The arrogance was gone. In its place was a deep, weary exhaustion. He looked older than he had in the restaurant. "Yes," he said quietly. "I suppose I do. Please sit." She remained standing. "Start talking." He sighed, a long, heavy sound, and gestured to a leather chair. This time, she sat, perching on the edge. "I didn't know Robert Hayes," he began. And Ellie's heart sank with a flash of disappointment. "Was it all just another cruel game? I knew a man named Rob, a lanky, brilliant, perpetually broke piano teacher who ran a makeshift music school out of a dusty old workshop in the Bywater." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. No one called him Rob except his oldest friends. "I was 12 years old," Julian continued, his gaze distant, lost in a past she couldn't imagine. I was homeless. My mother had just passed, and I was living on the street, sleeping in alleyways. I was smart, but I was angry. The world had shown me nothing but its teeth. He walked over to a wet bar and poured 2 glasses of water. His movements slow and deliberate. One day, I was huddled in a doorway trying to stay out of a thunderstorm, and I heard music. It was jazz, but it was like nothing I'd ever heard. It was complex and beautiful and sad. I followed the sound to this old workshop. The door was propped open, and there was your father, his eyes closed, his hands flying over the keys of a beat-up old upright. He handed her a glass of water. His hand was perfectly steady. He saw me standing in the rain, a skinny, soaking wet black kid staring at him. Most people would have chased me away, yelled at me, called the cops. But Rob, he just smiled. He beckoned me inside and asked, "You like the music, son?" Tears pricked at Ellie's eyes. This was her father. This was the man she knew. He gave me a dry towel and a sandwich. Julian's voice grew thick with emotion. And then he offered me something no one else ever had. A chance. He told me he saw something in my eyes. A fire. He taught me to play. For free. He saw I had a mind for patterns, for logic, so he didn't just teach me music. He taught me theory, structure. He taught me how to think. That workshop, it became my home. Rob became the father I never had. He paused, collecting himself. I was his JJ. That was his nickname for me. Julian Jr. Ellie gasped. JJ. The name from her father's old stories. The prodigy. The boy who disappeared. So why? Ellie finally managed to ask. Her voice choked. Why the cruelty? The public humiliation? If you cared about him, why would you do that to me? Julian's face tightened with a deep, profound pain, because when I finally made something of myself, I came back for him. I wanted to give him everything, but he was gone. The workshop was boarded up. No one knew where he went. I hired investigators, spent a fortune trying to find him. By the time I did, it was too late. I found his obituary online. He looked at her. His eyes filled with a raw, agonizing guilt. And then I found you. His daughter, a musical genius in your own right, wasting away, serving drinks to people who weren't fit to tune your father's piano. I saw you giving up. I saw his legacy, the fire he passed on, dying out. And it made me angry. He finally confessed, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. I didn't want to hurt you, Ellie. I wanted to make you angry. I wanted to make you furious enough to fight back. To remember who you are. To fight for yourself the way your father fought for me. It was a cruel, clumsy, desperate plan. And I am sorry for the pain it caused you. The truth was overwhelming. A tidal wave of conflicting emotions. He hadn't been a villain. He'd been a grieving son, trying to honor a father figure in the only way his hard, brutal life had taught him how. But it didn't erase the sting. Why didn't you just tell me? She asked, tears now streaming freely down her face. Why didn't you just help us? He was so sick, we had nothing. The question hung in the air, a terrible accusation. Julian Vance, the man who could buy and sell entire countries, had let his mentor die in poverty. And the look of pure, unadulterated agony that crossed his face told Ellie that this was a question he had been asking himself every single day. The silence in Julian's office was heavy, with the weight of unspoken grief and years of misunderstanding. Ellie felt emotionally exhausted, as if she had run a marathon. The anger that had fueled her for weeks had been replaced by a confusing swirl of sympathy and a lingering, bitter resentment. She understood his motives, but understanding didn't erase the image of her father, thin and frail, worrying about medical bills. I need to show you something, Julian said, his voice quiet. He led her out of the sterile corporate tower and into the humid embrace of the New Orleans streets. His sleek black car, driven by a silent chauffeur, carried them away from the polished world of the central business district and deep into the labyrinthine, colorful streets of the Bywater. The car stopped in front of a dilapidated, two-story building. Its facade was peeling, the windows boarded up, a faded sign above the door reading Hayes and Sons, piano tuning, and repair. The Sons had always been a joke between her and her father. It was just the two of them. "This is it," Julian said, his voice thick. He produced a key and unlocked a heavy, rusted padlock on the front door. The air that rushed out was musty, thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and ghosts. Inside, sunlight struggled through cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like lazy spirits. It was exactly as Ellie remembered it, only smaller, sadder. The main room was dominated by the hulking shapes of pianos in various states of disrepair, all draped in white sheets like slumbering giants. "He taught me right there," Julian said, pointing to a corner where a scarred wooden workbench sat next to the beat-up upright he'd mentioned. "He taught me that a piano isn't just an instrument, it's a machine. A beautiful, complex machine. To understand the music, you had to understand the mechanics." He ran a hand over the dusty workbench, his touch gentle, reverent. "This was the first real home I ever knew. Rob gave me a key. He told me I could sleep on the old cot in the back room as long as I promised to practice and do my homework." Julian's voice was stripped of its corporate armor, revealing the vulnerable boy he had once been. "He didn't just teach me music, Ellie. He taught me about discipline, about structure, the logic I used to build my company. It all started here. Learning the mathematical relationship between a major third and a perfect fifth." He turned to her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "I was a lost cause, an angry kid from the streets. Society had written me off. Your father was the only person who saw potential instead of a problem. He saved my life." Listening to him, seeing the raw emotion on his face in this place so sacred to her own memory, Ellie felt the last of her anger begin to dissolve. It was replaced by a shared grief, a common thread of love for the man who had shaped both their lives in such different ways. For the first time, she saw Julian not as a billionaire tormentor, but as JJ, the kid her father had spoken of with such pride. Later that week, back in her own apartment, Ellie decided it was time. Time to finally sort through the boxes of her father's belongings she had pushed into a closet, too painful to touch after his death. Now, armed with a new understanding, she felt a duty to face it. She pulled out a dusty cardboard box labeled Music and Memos. Inside were stacks of sheet music, old concert programs, and several worn, spiral-bound notebooks filled with her father's elegant, looping handwriting. They were his journals. She sat on the floor, flipping through the pages, a bittersweet journey through her father's thoughts. He wrote about music, about his frustrations with money, about his immense pride in her. And then she found it, an entire section dedicated to JJ. "JJ has a mind like a steel trap," one entry read. "He absorbs theory like a sponge. I believe that boy can do anything he sets his mind to. He has a fire in him that could light up the world or burn it down. I pray he chooses the former." A sad smile touched Ellie's lips. Her father had been right. She kept reading, her heart aching with love and loss. She turned to the last few pages, written in the final difficult months of his illness. The handwriting was shakier. The ink sometimes smudged. He wrote of his failing health, his worries for her future, and his regret over the unfinished sonata. And then she saw the entry that made her blood run cold. It was dated just 2 months before he died. "The doctors gave me the final word today. Not much time left. The medical bills are a mountain I can't climb. I have to put my pride aside. For Ellie's sake, I finally did it." I swallowed my fear and wrote to JJ. "I found his corporate address online. I know he's a big shot now, a billionaire. I didn't ask for a handout, just a loan, something to get us through this. I told him I would pay him back, every cent." I sent the letter a month ago. Ellie held her breath, her fingers trembling as she turned to the final, devastating page. The entry was short, the handwriting barely legible. No reply. A month and not a single word. I tried to call his office, but they wouldn't put me through. I suppose a man like that has bigger things to worry about than an old piano teacher from his past. I was a fool to hope. It seems I put my faith in the wrong person after all. The journal felt like a block of ice in Ellie's hands. The fragile bridge of understanding she had just built with Julian crumbled into dust. The image of him in the dusty workshop, his voice, thick with emotion, now seemed like a grotesque performance. He had painted a picture of a desperate search for his mentor, but her father's own words painted a picture of betrayal, a desperate plea for help that had been met with a cold corporate silence. The old anger came roaring back, hotter and more bitter than before. This wasn't about a clumsy attempt to motivate her. This was about neglect. She didn't call. She didn't wait in his lobby. She took a taxi straight to his office tower, the journal clutched in her hand like a weapon. She bypassed the front desk, ignoring the receptionist's startled protests, and strode directly to the executive elevators. His severe-looking assistant, Jessica, stepped out to intercept her, her expression like a thundercloud. "Mr. Vance is in a meeting. You can't." "Get out of my way," Ellie said, her voice low and dangerous. Something in her eyes must have conveyed the seriousness of her mission, because Jessica, for the first time, looked uncertain. Just then, the door to the conference room opened, and Julian emerged with a group of men in suits. He saw Ellie, and his professional smile faltered. He excused himself from the group and walked toward her, a question in his eyes. "Ellie, what's wrong?" She didn't say a word. She just held out the open journal. He took it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the shaky handwriting. She watched his face as he read the final, heartbreaking entries. The color drained from his cheeks. His confident posture sagged, and he had to put a hand on the wall to steady himself. The look on his face wasn't guilt. It was pure, unadulterated shock. "I never got this," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Ellie, I swear on my life, on his memory. I never saw any letter. I never got any message." "It's right here, Julian," she shot back, her voice breaking. In his own words. "He reached out, and you ignored him. You let him die thinking his JJ had abandoned him." "No," he said, his mind clearly racing. He turned to his assistant, Jessica. "In 2018, who was my executive assistant? Who handled my personal correspondence?" Jessica paled. That would have been Marcus Thorne, sir." Julian's eyes went hard as flint. "The one I fired for insider trading?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. Julian turned back to Ellie, a dawning horror on his face. "Marcus," he explained, his voice strained. "He was ambitious, ruthless. He built a wall around me. He believed anyone from my old life was a potential threat, a grifter looking for a handout. He filtered everything. He must have seen the letter, decided it was beneath my notice." The explanation was plausible. It was horrifyingly plausible. But for Ellie, raw with a lifetime of grief, it sounded like an excuse. "How convenient," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Someone else to blame." "It's not an excuse." Julian's voice cracked with a pain that mirrored her own. "It's a failure. My failure. I built an empire, but I let it isolate me. I trusted the wrong people. I wasn't there for him when he needed me." He looked down at the journal, at the shaky script of the man who had saved him, and he died thinking I didn't care. That's a truth I have to live with forever. He looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't change that, Ellie. God knows I wish I could. But we can change. What happens now?" He took a deep breath, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "His sonata," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old command. "In the journal. Does he say why he was writing it?" Ellie blinked, thrown by the sudden shift. She flipped back a few pages. He mentions a competition. The Orleans International Piano Competition. He thought if he won the grand prize, he could use the money to open a real music school. A free one. For kids like... Her voice trailed off. "For kids like you." A heavy silence fell between them, filled with the weight of that final, unrealized dream. "Then that's what we'll do," Julian said, his voice filled with a new, fierce determination. "It's too late for the competition, but it's not too late for his dream. We'll start the Robert Hayes Music Foundation. I'll provide the funding, all of it, the building, the instruments, the staff. You," he said, looking at her with a desperate intensity, "will be its soul, its artistic director. You'll run it." He took another step closer. "But first, we have to finish his legacy. The sonata. It needs to be heard, not in a competition, but in a place of honor. We'll stage a tribute concert, a fundraiser to launch the foundation. You'll perform it. The proposal was breathtaking. It was everything her father had ever wanted. It was a chance to turn their shared tragedy into something beautiful, something that would last. It was also a chance for forgiveness. Not just for her to forgive Julian, but for both of them to forgive themselves. The path forward was suddenly clear. A single, harmonious chord in a sea of dissonance. She looked from Julian's pleading face to the journal in his hand, its pages filled with the story of their shared past. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll do it. Together." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of focused creation. The animosity between Ellie and Julian was gone, replaced by a shared, almost sacred purpose. They didn't work in Julian's sterile office or her cramped apartment. Instead, they returned to the one place that felt right. Her father's old workshop in the Bywater. Julian's resources transformed the space. A crew of workers carefully restored the building, patching the roof, replacing the windows, and polishing the old wooden floors until they shone. But they were instructed to preserve its character, its soul. The workbench remained scarred, the ghosts of old projects left undisturbed. At the center of the revived room, delivered with the reverence of a holy relic, sat her father's Baldwin, now meticulously restored to its former glory by the finest technicians in the country. Their days were spent hunched over the piano and stacks of her father's notes. The sonata was a brilliant, chaotic puzzle. Robert Hayes had left behind dozens of fragments, a powerful melodic line here, a complex chord progression there, a scrawled note about the feeling of a storm passing in a margin. It was a treasure map without a key. This was where they found their harmony. Ellie, with her innate, inherited understanding of her father's musical language, could decipher the emotional intent behind the notes. She would play a phrase, her eyes closed, and say, "No, this part needs to feel like a question, not a statement." Julian, with his ruthlessly logical mind, saw the structure she couldn't. He wasn't a musician, not anymore, but he understood patterns better than anyone. He would listen to her play, his head tilted, and say, "That transition is weak. It breaks the narrative arc. What if you modulate to a minor key before the crescendo? It would create more tension, a greater sense of release." They argued, they debated, they pushed each other. He challenged her to be bolder with her improvisations. She challenged him to feel the music instead of just analyzing it. In the process of piecing together Robert's sonata, they began to piece together the fractured parts of their own relationship. They weren't falling in love in a traditional sense. It was something deeper, a bond forged in shared grief and a profound mutual respect. They were two different instruments, playing in harmony for the first time. The night of the tribute concert arrived. The Orpheum Theater, a historic New Orleans landmark, was filled to capacity. The event, branded the Robert Hayes Foundation inaugural concert, had become the city's most anticipated event. Julian's name had drawn the wealthy and the powerful, but news of the story behind it, the story of the brilliant unsung teacher, had drawn the city's true music lovers. Backstage, Ellie stood in the wings, her heart a steady, calm drum. She wasn't the terrified waitress from the Gilded Lily anymore. She was her father's daughter, about to give his music to the world. She wore a simple, elegant black gown, a stark contrast to her old uniform. Julian found her there. He wasn't in his usual power suit, but a classic tuxedo. The guarded, intimidating billionaire was gone. In his place was JJ, the nervous kid from the Bywater. "He would be so proud of you, Ellie," he said, his voice quiet. "He'd be proud of us," she corrected him gently. She walked onto the stage to a wave of applause. The spotlight was warm, not harsh. She sat at the grand piano, and as the audience fell silent, she found Julian in the front row. He wasn't looking at her with guilt or pity. He was looking at her with pure, unadulterated pride and a quiet, peaceful gratitude. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The sonata filled the theater, a living, breathing entity. It was a story of struggle, of jazz and the classics, of New Orleans itself. It was a story of a father's love, a student's gratitude, and a daughter's resilience. It was a piece of music that had been born in a dusty workshop and was now soaring in a grand concert hall. It was perfect. When the final triumphant chord faded, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of emotion, of understanding. Then the theater erupted. The standing ovation was deafening, a roar of approval that went on and on. Ellie stood and bowed, tears of joy and release streaming down her face. She wasn't just accepting applause for herself. She was accepting it for her father. The story doesn't end with a kiss or a romantic declaration. It ends 6 months later, on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The Robert Hayes Music Foundation is officially open, housed in the beautifully restored workshop. The main room is filled with the chaotic, wonderful sound of children learning to play. Trumpets squawk, violins screech, and from a dozen pianos, the hesitant notes of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" fill the air. Ellie moves between the students, her touch gentle, her voice encouraging. She kneels beside a small, shy girl, struggling with a chord on the piano, her father's Baldwin. "Like this," she says softly, guiding the girl's small fingers. "Don't be afraid of the notes. Just tell your story." From the doorway, Julian Vance watches, unnoticed. He isn't the imposing billionaire from Chapter 1. He's just a man, watching a promise being kept, a debt of grace being repaid, in the most beautiful way imaginable. A quiet smile touches his lips. The Sonata of Robert Hayes wasn't a single piece of music. It was a legacy. And in the laughter and fledgling melodies of these children, it had finally become what it was always meant to be: unending.